Picture this. You wake up to the grinding roar of concrete mixers destroying a creek that's flowed behind your home since before the Civil War. The smell of diesel exhaust mixing with crushed limestone fills your nostrils as you watch $80,000 of your homeowner fees get poured into what used to be a crystal-clear mountain stream. It's for flood control, HOA President Brenda Hartwell smugly announces from her white Tesla. What this real estate agent didn't know? I'm a retired Army Corps hydrologist, and she just created a ticking time bomb. Fast forward 6 months. Brenda's $1 million home sits in 2 feet of swamp water, foundation cracking, while my shabby property stays bone dry. The FBI is knocking on her door, and that concrete channel she was so proud of, it's about to cost her everything. What would you do if your HOA stole your money to destroy your peace? Where are you watching from? Bet your neighbors have tried something this insane too. My name's Dale Brennan, 58 years old, and until 6 months ago I thought the biggest threat to my sanity was finding carburetor parts for a 1972 Harley Sportster. Turns out, I was wrong. The real threat was a HOA board president who confused a real estate license with a PhD in hydroengineering. I inherited my grandfather's 2-acre slice of paradise in what used to be rural Colorado, back when Willowbrook was nothing but cattle pasture, and the only HOA stood for Herd of Angus. My grandfather, William Brennan, was a combat engineer who survived Normandy and came home to build something beautiful. This creek was his therapy. Every morning for 3 years since retiring from the Army Corps of Engineers, I'd follow the same ritual: coffee on the back porch, listening to Cottonwood Creek babble over smooth granite stones, the scent of motor oil from my workshop mixed with wet willow bark, the sound of hammering echoing across crystal-clear water at dawn. My boots crunching on gravel paths grandfather laid by hand in 1948. Martha, my wife of 26 years, teaches 4th grade and has the patience of a saint, which she'd need for what was coming. Our kids scattered like tumbleweeds. Jessica's saving lives as a trauma nurse in Portland. Mike's debugging software in Austin. Both inherited grandfather's stubborn streak. What made our property special wasn't the 1950s ranch house or my cluttered workshop full of vintage motorcycle parts. It was 400 yards of creek with water rights dating to 1873, older than Colorado statehood, older than electric lights, and definitely older than suburban princesses with attitude problems. Then came Willowbrook Estates, sprouting around us like expensive mushrooms after rain. 47 homes, average price $900,000, mostly California refugees fleeing their own HOA disasters. The irony was thicker than morning mist on the creek. Enter our villain, Brenda Hartwell, 52, HOA board president and self-appointed empress of suburban perfection. Fresh from Marin County with that particular blend of entitlement and ignorance that only comes from selling overpriced houses to desperate people. White Tesla, vanity plates reading "sold for you," and those pearl earrings she wore like battle armor. Her husband's some investment banker who commutes to Denver. Kids attend private school where they probably learn that people like me are economically disadvantaged, rather than chose different priorities. Their $1.2 million colonial backs right up to my creek, manicured lawn ending where real nature begins. The first shot came on a Tuesday morning that smelled like fresh coffee and impending legal bills. Official HOA violation notice, certified mail. Unsightly storage of automotive parts visible from neighboring properties violates community aesthetic standards. Fine, $200 per day until compliance achieved. I read it twice, the legal absurdity sinking in like creek water into dry soil. Here's what Brenda's expensive lawyers missed. My property predates their HOA by 80 years. Grandfather's deed included mineral rights, water rights, and a grandfathered exemption from future development restrictions. But they were betting this old mechanic wouldn't know basic property law. The face-to-face meeting went exactly as you'd expect. Brenda's office reeked of vanilla candles and entitlement. She suggested, with that practiced smile real estate agents perfect in expensive mirrors, that I might be happier somewhere with more flexible property standards. Translation: somewhere poor people belong. I responded with a certified letter explaining that HOA covenants don't apply to grandfathered properties. Basic real estate law, first thing they teach when you're dealing with water rights and easements. Her retaliation was swift and expensive. Anonymous complaints to the county about illegal business operations, because apparently fixing motorcycles looks suspicious to people who pay others to change their oil. Building inspector crawled through my workshop for 2 hours, found nothing wrong except my organizational system. Still cost me $1,200 in lawyer fees, proving I wasn't running a chop shop. But that was just Brenda testing the waters, literally and figuratively. The real insanity started when she discovered my water rights were complicated. In Colorado, water means power. And in Brenda's world, people like me, with calloused hands and grandfathered property, don't deserve either. That's when I realized this wasn't about motorcycle parts. This was war. Spring snowmelt was running heavy that year, and Cottonwood Creek sang louder than usual as it rushed over the Beaver Dam 100 yards upstream. The sound of fast water over granite mixed with the scent of wet willow bark and morning mist rising from the surface. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it became the soundtrack to Brenda's next brilliant legal maneuver. She'd done her homework this time, or thought she had. Hired Pemberton and Associates, a Denver law firm that specialized in what they politely called environmental property disputes, which is lawyer speak for creative ways to screw your neighbors using government regulations. Their strategy was elegant in its ruthlessness. File a nuisance water flow complaint with the county, claiming my property created dangerous runoff that threatened those precious million-dollar homes downstream. The legal papers arrived on a Thursday morning, thick as a Denver phone book, and about as useful. 57 pages of technical jargon that basically said, make the old guy prove his 150-year-old creek isn't going to flood our clients' McMansions. They wanted to force me into a $50,000 environmental impact study. You know, the kind that takes 2 years and requires hiring the same consultants who probably golf with their lawyers on weekends. Martha found me that evening standing knee-deep in creek water, my boots squelching in muddy bank while I checked flow patterns with grandfather's old surveyor's rod. "What are you thinking?" she asked, using that elementary school teacher voice that meant she could smell trouble brewing. "I'm thinking Brenda's fancy lawyers just made a $50,000 mistake," I said, watching water swirl around a boulder grandfather had positioned by hand in 1953. "And I'm thinking they picked the wrong retired engineer to mess with. See, here's something I learned during 30 years with the Army Corps. Lawyers love complicated-sounding environmental regulations because they assume regular people won't understand them. What they forget is that some of us actually designed the systems they're trying to regulate. It's like watching someone explain how your own car engine works, to you, the guy who built it." I called my old colleague Pete Morrison at the Colorado Water Authority. Took him exactly 10 minutes to spot what Pemberton and Associates had missed. They'd based their entire legal complaint on watershed maps from 1967. Before the interstate was built, before half the subdivisions upstream existed, before modern storm drainage systems changed every flow pattern in the valley. "Dale," Pete chuckled over the phone, "these maps show creek behavior that hasn't existed since Nixon was in office. You want me to send the real surveys? This is going to be embarrassing. For them." The modern geological data told a completely different story. Far from causing problems, my section of creek actually prevented flooding by creating natural retention during spring runoff. Those granite boulders grandfather positioned, they weren't just decorative. The old combat engineer had built a flood control system before most people knew what the term meant. But here's where it got really interesting. Back in engineering school, they taught us about something called prior appropriation doctrine. Basically, Colorado water law runs on the principle of first come, first served. Since my family had documented water use dating to 1873, our rights trumped anything filed after that date, including Brenda's entire subdivision, her HOA, and probably her great-grandchildren's future complaints. I spent that weekend in my workshop, surrounded by grandfather's engineering notebooks and modern county survey maps, connecting dots that Brenda's lawyers had completely missed. The familiar smell of motor oil mixed with old paper, the scratch of pencil on graph paper, it felt like channeling the old man's ghost. And maybe I was. Monday morning, I filed my own complaint with the county. Not just a defense, a counterattack. I demanded that Brenda's group pay for a proper environmental assessment, since their legal harassment was based on fraudulent data. Attached Pete's analysis showing how their precious development actually increased flood risk for everyone downstream. The county water commissioner, a guy named Rodriguez who'd been dealing with water disputes since before Brenda discovered Colorado existed, took one look at my documentation and started laughing. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "these people just tried to lecture a hydrologist about water flow using maps from the Johnson administration. This might be the shortest water rights case in state history." 2 weeks later, complete vindication. The county sided with me on every point, ordered the HOA to cease all water-related harassment, and officially validated my historical water rights. Suddenly, my claims weren't just grandfathered, they were carved in legal stone. But victory came with interesting side effects. The local newspaper ran the story. HOA challenges century-old water rights, loses spectacularly. Neighbors I'd never met started appearing at my workshop door with their own Brenda horror stories. Violations for non-conforming mailboxes, fines for unauthorized garden decorations, threats about inappropriate exterior paint colors. That evening, Martha found me by the creek at sunset, grandfather's fishing rod in my hands, but no intention of actually fishing. "This is where he taught me about water," I told her. "How it always finds the easiest path, but never stops flowing toward where it belongs." "And where does this particular water belong?" she asked. I smiled, listening to Cottonwood Creek babble over stones that predated Brenda's bloodline by several geological epochs. Right through the middle of her perfect little kingdom. You'd think losing a water rights case would teach someone humility. You'd be wrong. Brenda Hartwell had apparently graduated from the school of doubling down on bad ideas, because her next move was so audacious, it actually impressed me. In a horrifying, watching someone jump off a cliff while screaming about their constitutional right to fly kind of way. 3 weeks after the county told her to back off, Brenda called an emergency HOA board meeting. Of course, she scheduled it during the 1 week Martha and I had planned a vacation to visit Jessica in Portland, our first real break since this whole mess started. The meeting notice got sent to our old address from 2 moves ago, ensuring we couldn't object to whatever fresh insanity she was cooking up. The agenda item looked innocent enough. Emergency flood mitigation assessment. What actually happened was Brenda presenting doctored photographs showing severe erosion damage to HOA property. Pictures that looked suspiciously like they'd been taken after she'd hired someone to dig holes near the creek with a backhoe. She claimed her engineering consultant, a guy who turned out to be her cousin's landscaping contractor, had determined that immediate concrete channeling was needed to prevent catastrophic property damage. The vote passed 6-1, with only Edwin Kowalski objecting. Edwin called me in Portland that night, his Polish accent thick with disgust. "Dale, this woman, she is crazy person. She says flood will destroy everything if we don't put concrete in your creek. She has pictures, but something smells like fish that sits in sun too long." Special assessment. $1,800 per homeowner for emergency flood control infrastructure. Total project cost, $127,000 for what any actual engineer could have told them was completely unnecessary. But Brenda had found her golden hammer, and suddenly every problem looked like a nail that needed concrete. I cut our vacation short and drove home through the night, Martha sleeping fitfully in the passenger seat while I white-knuckled the steering wheel and calculated how much damage they could do in 72 hours. The answer, as it turned out, was a lot. The sound hit me first, jackhammers and diesel engines growling where morning bird songs used to live. Then the smell, concrete dust mixing with destroyed vegetation, diesel exhaust hanging in the valley like industrial fog. I rounded the corner to my driveway and saw what Brenda had done to 150 years of natural beauty. My creek was gone. In its place, an ugly concrete trough that looked like a prison drainage ditch. Clear mountain water that used to dance over smooth stones now flowed through an 18-inch deep gray channel that belonged in an urban wasteland, not the Colorado mountains. They'd buried grandfather's carefully positioned boulders under tons of concrete, destroying fish spawning areas that had existed since before Colorado was a state. Martha stood beside me, tears streaming down her face. "They killed it," she whispered. "They actually killed a living creek." But here's the thing about being a hydrologist who spent 3 decades dealing with environmental regulations. You learn to think like water. And water always finds the truth eventually. I spent the next week documenting everything. Photographs from every angle, water flow measurements, samples for chemical analysis. More importantly, I researched Pinnacle Construction, the company that had done the work. Turns out they had quite the track record. 3 EPA violations in 5 years, $75,000 in fines for unauthorized waterway modifications, and a pattern of starting work before permits were approved. Because here's something every property owner should understand. Any significant modification to a natural waterway requires approval from the county, the state environmental agency, and often the EPA. It's like a legal 3-layer cake, and you need permission for every layer. Brenda's crew had skipped all 3. The Clean Water Act doesn't mess around when it comes to unauthorized concrete and fish habitat. I'd seen cases where violators faced $25,000 per day in fines, and that was just the federal level. Colorado's Environmental Protection Agency could add another $10,000 daily. The math was simple. Every day that concrete stayed in place was another $35,000 in potential fines. I filed complaints with every agency that had jurisdiction. County Code Enforcement, State Environmental Protection, and the EPA's Region 8 office in Denver. Then I called the local Trout Unlimited chapter, whose president nearly had a stroke when I described what they'd done to the spawning areas. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "this is exactly the kind of habitat destruction we've been fighting for 20 years. We'll provide whatever support you need, legal, financial, technical witnesses. These people just declared war on every fish in Colorado." The counterattack was swift and comprehensive. Within 10 days, I had 3 separate government agencies investigating, an environmental law clinic from the University of Colorado offering free legal representation, and enough documentation to bury Pemberton and Associates in their own paperwork. But Brenda wasn't finished. Edwin Kowalski warned me she was already planning the next escalation, a full flood control system that would concrete the entire creek from the county road to the subdivision boundary. Her reasoning? If we're going to do this, we might as well do it right. That night, I sat in my workshop surrounded by grandfather's engineering notebooks, studying his 1950s photographs of the natural creek system. The old combat engineer had designed something beautiful that worked for 70 years without a single flood incident. Brenda had destroyed it in 3 days, but she'd also just handed me enough federal violations to put her in prison. If you've ever wondered what desperation smells like, it's vanilla candles mixed with fear sweat in a real estate office at 7 a.m. That's where I found myself 3 weeks later, sitting across from Brenda Hartwell as she tried to convince me that black was white and concrete was natural. "Dale," she said, sliding a manila envelope across her glass desk, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. This whole situation has been unfortunate." Inside the envelope, a cashier's check for $500,000 and a non-disclosure agreement thicker than my grandfather's engineering manual. The offer was simple and illegal as hell. Take the money, agree never to discuss the creek situation publicly, and relocate outside the county within 6 months. Oh, and sign over my water rights to the HOA for proper management. The threat was barely veiled. Legal battles are expensive, Dale. Even when you win, you lose. Think about Martha's job security. I'd brought a small digital recorder, perfectly legal in Colorado with single-party consent, and Brenda's next words were pure gold. "If you don't take this offer, I'll make sure every property owner in this valley knows you're an anti-development extremist who's trying to destroy property values. My real estate connections go deep, and your wife's teaching career could become complicated." That same week, my workshop got vandalized again. This time they weren't subtle about it. Vintage motorcycle parts scattered across the floor, tools stolen, and my restored 1972 Sportster tipped over with sugar poured in the gas tank. But they'd made a mistake. The new security cameras I'd installed caught everything, including a clear shot of a white Tesla parked at the end of my driveway at 2 a.m. The psychological warfare escalated daily. Anonymous online reviews started appearing from Martha's after-school tutoring business. Unprofessional, political agenda. Don't trust your children with radicals. Someone called her principal with concerns about her fitness to teach. The stress was eating at both of us, Martha losing sleep, me checking my blood pressure twice a day. But here's what Brenda didn't understand about engineers. We're methodical. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every anonymous complaint got documented with the precision of a federal investigation, because that's exactly what it was becoming. The EPA had opened a formal case file. The Colorado Attorney General's office sent investigators. Local environmental groups were treating this like the Exxon Valdez of suburban creek destruction. And I was gathering allies faster than Brenda was making enemies. Sarah Olivia, a third-year environmental law student at the University of Colorado, had taken my case as her senior thesis project. She'd discovered something interesting while digging through HOA financial records, a pattern of inflated contracts with companies that had mysterious connections to Brenda's real estate network. "Mr. Brennan," she said, spreading documents across my workshop table, "this concrete project cost $127,000 for work that should have been $40,000 maximum. The excess went to consulting fees and emergency contractor premiums that all trace back to companies owned by Brenda's business associates. The girl had found smoking guns where I'd only suspected smoke. Board meetings held in secret. Contracts approved without competitive bidding. Special assessments used to fund personal vendettas. What started as environmental destruction was looking more like organized fraud. But the real revelation came from grandfather's engineering notebooks. While researching the original creek design, I'd found his 1973 consulting report for the county, a document that predicted exactly what was happening now. He'd warned against concrete channeling in this specific location, calculating that it would increase downstream flooding risk by 300% during spring runoff. The report included detailed flowcharts, seasonal water tables, and soil absorption rates. everything Brenda's engineering consultant had ignored. More importantly, it proved that someone with actual engineering credentials had already studied this problem 50 years ago and reached the opposite conclusion from Brenda's landscaper. That's when I realized the beautiful irony of the situation. Brenda thought she was solving a flooding problem, but she'd actually created a hydraulic time bomb. Spring snowmelt was 6 weeks away, and the concrete channel was going to direct every drop of water straight toward the HOA home's foundations. The natural creek had meandered through my property, distributing flow across a wide floodplain that absorbed excess water like a sponge. The concrete channel eliminated that natural absorption, creating a high-pressure water cannon aimed directly at million-dollar basements. I spent that weekend with my calculator, grandfather's flow charts, and current weather predictions. The math was terrifying and beautiful. When the spring floods hit, and they would hit hard that year, Brenda's concrete solution would turn a manageable water flow into a foundation-destroying torrent. My property, being upstream and naturally elevated, would stay bone dry. The HOA homes, sitting downstream from the concrete channel, were going to flood like a submarine with screen doors. Edwin Kowalski stopped by that Sunday evening, finding me sketching restoration plans at my kitchen table. "Dale," he said, "this woman Brenda, she is making big mistake, yes?" I looked at the weather service predictions showing heavy snowpack and wet spring ahead, then at grandfather's engineering calculations proving exactly what would happen when physics met stupidity. "Edwin," I said, "she just built the world's most expensive lawsuit. The creek was going to have its revenge with compound interest." Sarah Olivia arrived at my workshop on a gray February morning with a banker's box full of documents and the kind of expression that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Not me, thankfully. "Mr. Brennan," she said, setting the box on my workbench with a satisfying thump, "I think you're going to want to sit down for this." For 3 weeks, Sarah had been conducting what she called forensic accounting on the HOA's financial records, basically following the money trail like a bloodhound with a CPA license. What she'd found would have made the FBI's white-collar crime unit weep with joy. The concrete project that cost homeowners $127,000. The actual work was worth maybe $40,000. The remaining $87,000 had disappeared into a maze of consulting fees, emergency contractor premiums, and environmental assessment costs that all led back to companies with suspiciously familiar names. Hartwell Property Consulting, Willowbrook Environmental Solutions. Brenda wasn't just destroying my creek, she was robbing her own neighbors blind while doing it. But that was just the appetizer. The main course came when Edwin Kowalski shuffled into my workshop 20 minutes later, clutching a small digital recorder like it contained the secrets of the universe, which, in a way, it did. "Dale," he said, his Polish accent thick with righteous anger, "you remember I told you I voted against concrete project? I maybe forgot to mention I recorded whole meeting." The recording was devastating. Brenda's voice, clear as mountain water, explaining to the board that the real goal wasn't flood control. It was driving out incompatible residents who don't understand our community vision. She'd explicitly discussed using HOA funds to force me into expensive legal battles, knowing most people couldn't afford to fight back. The best part? Her admission that the concrete project wasn't about preventing floods. It was about eliminating anything that made the neighborhood look rural or working class. She wanted to remove every trace of the area's ranching heritage to boost property values for her real estate business. But the real bombshell was buried in grandfather's engineering files. While organizing his papers for the legal case, I'd found a folder marked Willowbrook Development Consultation, 1973. Inside, a complete hydrological analysis he'd done for the county, warning against any concrete channeling in this exact location. His calculations were precise and prophetic. Concrete channeling would eliminate the natural flood absorption capacity of the creek bed, directing 100% of spring runoff toward the downstream development area. During heavy snowmelt years, like this one, the result would be catastrophic foundation flooding for any homes built in the natural floodplain, which was exactly where Brenda's house sat. The engineering report included detailed topographical maps showing that my property was naturally elevated above the flood zone, while the HOA development occupied the traditional overflow area. Grandfather had actually recommended against building there, but developers in the 1990s had ignored his warnings. Reading his meticulous notes felt like receiving a message from the grave. The creek will reclaim its floodplain eventually. Concrete will only make it angry when it does. Sarah spread the financial evidence across my workbench while I laid out grandfather's engineering predictions. The pattern was clear. Brenda had embezzled nearly $90,000 from her neighbors to build a flood creation device that would destroy their homes while keeping mine safe. "This is conspiracy, fraud, environmental destruction, and possibly racketeering," Sarah said, organizing documents into neat legal piles. "The EPA violations alone could put her in federal prison. Add in the financial crimes, and she's looking at serious time." Martha joined us for coffee, studying the evidence with her teacher's eye for patterns. "She played herself," she said quietly. "Every move she made to hurt us actually created more evidence against her." Outside, February snow was melting faster than usual, and Cottonwood Creek was starting to run high in its concrete prison. Weather Service predictions called for the heaviest spring runoff in 20 years. Brenda had built herself a ticking time bomb and handed me the evidence to convict her when it exploded. The only question now was whether I should warn her neighbors what was coming, or let physics teach the lesson grandfather's engineering had predicted 50 years ago. My workshop had transformed from a motorcycle restoration garage into something that looked like a war room designed by engineers who'd watched too many spy movies. Every surface was covered with maps, legal documents, financial records, and grandfather's engineering drawings. The coffee pot ran constantly, the landline never stopped ringing, and Martha had started bringing sandwich platters for the steady stream of allies showing up at our door. The restoration of my 1972 Harley Sportster sat in the corner, finally completed, a symbol of bringing dead things back to life, which seemed appropriate considering what we were planning for the creek. Kate Morrison, the environmental lawyer from the University of Colorado Legal Clinic, had officially taken my case pro bono after seeing Sarah's financial evidence. Kate was the kind of attorney who'd rather fight polluters than chase ambulances, and she approached environmental law like a chess grandmaster with a grudge. "Dale," she said, spreading out a timeline across my workbench, "we're not just fighting one case here. We're fighting 4 separate legal battles simultaneously, and we're going to win them all." The strategy was elegant in its complexity. Federal case, Clean Water Act violations and unauthorized habitat destruction. State case, water rights infringement and environmental permit fraud. County case, building code violations and improper special assessments. Civil case, fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Each case reinforced the others like overlapping fields of fire. Even if Brenda somehow won one battle, the other 3 would crush her. And thanks to something Kate called the private attorney general doctrine, we could recover all legal costs if we won. Environmental law actually encourages citizens to sue violators when government agencies can't keep up with enforcement. The financial investigation had grown into something beautiful and terrifying. Sarah had recruited 2 more law students and a forensic accounting professor who treated HOA fraud like a particularly interesting puzzle. They'd discovered that Brenda's pattern of inflated contracts extended back 3 years, involving landscaping, security systems, and legal consulting fees that all traced back to her business network. Total estimated embezzlement, over $200,000 from homeowner assessments. That wasn't just civil fraud, it was federal racketeering territory, with prison sentences measured in years rather than months. Meanwhile, I was designing the creek restoration using grandfather's original surveys and modern environmental engineering standards. The natural channel design would prevent flooding while restoring fish habitat at a total cost of about $35,000, less than half what Brenda had wasted on her concrete disaster. Colorado Trout Unlimited had committed $25,000 to the restoration fund. The Sierra Club added another $15,000. Local fishing clubs, environmental groups, and even some guilty HOA members were contributing to what we'd started calling the Cottonwood Creek Redemption Project. The community organizing had taken on a life of its own. Weekly meetings in my workshop drew 30 or 40 people, including veterans who appreciated seeing a combat engineer's grandson fight bureaucratic stupidity. Martha handled the social media campaign. #Save Cottonwood Creek had over 5,000 followers and growing. Dr. Angela Rodriguez from Colorado State's Environmental Engineering Department had volunteered to serve as our expert witness. She'd reviewed grandfather's 1973 predictions and confirmed them with modern computer modeling. The concrete channel would increase flood risk by 400% during heavy spring runoff, directing all that water straight toward the HOA home's foundations. "Your grandfather was 50 years ahead of his time," she told me, studying his hand-drawn flowcharts. "This is exactly how we design natural flood control today." Brenda didn't just destroy a creek. She eliminated a sophisticated engineering system that had been protecting the whole valley. The media strategy was coordinated through Kate's office. Local reporters loved the David versus Goliath angle, but we were being careful to focus on environmental protection rather than personal revenge. The story was spreading beyond Colorado, environmental law blogs, fishing magazines, even a documentary crew from Denver Public Television. But the secret weapon was still grandfather's historical evidence. His 1950s photographs showed exactly how the natural creek had handled spring floods for decades without causing any property damage. Those images would be devastating visual evidence in court, proving that concrete created the flood risk rather than preventing it. Weather Service predictions were confirming our worst-case scenarios. Heavy snowpack in the Rockies, warmer than normal spring temperatures, and multiple storm systems headed our way during peak snowmelt season. The concrete channel was going to face its first real test, and it was going to fail spectacularly. Edwin Kowalski had become our inside intelligence source, reporting on increasingly desperate HOA board meetings where remaining members were starting to panic about legal liability. 3 board members had already resigned, claiming they'd been misled about the project's legality. The timeline was accelerating faster than spring snowmelt. Federal EPA investigation formally opened. County DA announced criminal investigation into HOA financial management. State Environmental Agency issued emergency cease and desist orders. Multiple class action lawsuits filed by other HOA victims across Colorado. Martha and I spent our evenings walking the concrete-destroyed creek, planning its resurrection. The sound of water fighting against artificial constraints, the smell of concrete curing in mountain air. It was ugly, but temporary. "How long until we can bring it back to life?" she asked. I calculated seasonal flooding, legal timelines, and construction schedules. "By next spring, this creek will be more beautiful than grandfather ever imagined, assuming we survive this spring first." Desperation has a particular smell, part vanilla air freshener, part fierce sweat, and part the acrid burn of bridges being torched by someone too stubborn to admit defeat. That's what filled Brenda's real estate office at 6:47 a.m. on March 3rd, when she called me for an emergency meeting that felt more like a hostage negotiation. "Dale," she said, sliding another envelope across her glass desk, "I've been thinking about our situation. Maybe we can find a mutually beneficial solution." The envelope contained a cashier's check for $750,000 and a non-disclosure agreement that would have made the CIA proud. "Take the money, relocate outside Colorado, transfer my water rights to a conservation trust managed by the HOA, and never speak publicly about creek restoration, environmental law, or HOA governance." The threat was barely disguised. Legal battles destroy families, Dale. Ask Martha how her teaching career would survive if the school board heard about her husband's radical environmental activism. I'd brought my digital recorder again, perfectly legal in Colorado, and Brenda's next words were prosecutorial gold. "If you don't take this final offer, I'll personally ensure that every contractor, every supplier, every business owner in this valley knows you're a troublemaker who costs people money. Your wife's tutoring business, your motorcycle hobby, your reputation, all of it can disappear. I have connections you can't imagine." That same night, my workshop got hit again. This time they weren't just stealing, they were sending a message. My completed Harley was tipped over, frame bent, 40 hours of restoration work destroyed in minutes. Grandfather's original engineering notebooks were scattered across the floor, some pages torn, others soaked with motor oil. But they'd made a crucial mistake. The upgraded security system I'd installed after the first break-in captured everything in high-definition color, 2 figures in hoodies systematically vandalizing my property, followed by a white Tesla with distinctive vanity plates picking them up at 2:17 a.m. One of the vandals was wearing $300 sneakers that matched a pair I'd seen on Brenda's 17-year-old son. The psychological warfare escalated into something that belonged in a corporate thriller. Anonymous reviews bombing Martha's tutoring business. Unprofessional conduct, political indoctrination, unsafe environment for children. Someone created fake social media accounts spreading lies about my military service, claiming I'd been dishonorably discharged for mental instability and violent tendencies toward authority figures. The school principal called Martha in for a concerned conversation about complaints regarding her husband's increasingly erratic behavior. 3 parents canceled tutoring sessions after receiving anonymous letters warning them about dangerous political extremists in the education system. But here's what Brenda fundamentally misunderstood about engineers. We document everything. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every anonymous complaint went into a file system that would have impressed federal investigators, because that's exactly what they'd become. Agent Lisa Park from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Unit had opened a formal investigation into the HOA financial fraud. Agent Tom Rodriguez from the EPA's Criminal Enforcement Division was building a case around the environmental violations. Sarah Olivia's forensic accounting had provided them with a roadmap to nearly $200,000 in embezzled homeowner funds. The pressure was showing in Brenda's increasingly erratic behavior. Edwin Kowalski reported that she'd had screaming matches with 3 board members during their last meeting, accusing them of betraying the community vision by questioning legal expenses. 2 more board members resigned, leaving only Brenda and one loyal ally managing a subdivision in full legal meltdown. Meanwhile, spring snowmelt was accelerating faster than normal. March temperatures were running 15 degrees above average, and the National Weather Service had issued flood watches for the entire Front Range. Cottonwood Creek was already running at 150% of normal seasonal flow, and peak snowmelt was still 6 weeks away. I spent my evenings taking flow measurements, documenting how the concrete channel was handling increased water volume. The results were exactly what grandfather's engineering had predicted. Instead of spreading excess water across the natural floodplain, the concrete was concentrating 100% of the flow into a narrow, high-pressure stream aimed directly at the HOA homes. Dr. Rodriguez from Colorado State had run computer simulations showing that during peak flood conditions, water velocity in the concrete channel would reach levels capable of undermining foundation stability. Insurance companies were already asking questions about unauthorized modifications to natural drainage patterns, modifications that could void flood coverage entirely. The community support had grown beyond anything I'd expected. Local businesses displayed Support Dale signs. The high school environmental club adopted creek restoration as their senior project. Veterans organizations were treating this like an attack on one of their own. Regional fishing and environmental groups had turned my case into a symbol of grassroots resistance against corporate-style HOA tyranny. But Brenda wasn't finished escalating. Edwin warned me she was planning something desperate for the next board meeting, possibly hiring private security to protect HOA assets or attempting to get a restraining order claiming I was dangerous to community safety. That night, Martha found me in the workshop studying weather predictions and grandfather's flood calculations by lamplight. "How bad is it going to be?" she asked. I looked at the snowpack reports, the concrete channel flow rates, and the topographical maps showing exactly where all that pressurized water was headed. "Bad enough to end this permanently," I said. "One way or another." The phone call came at 5:23 a.m. on March 15th, jolting me awake with the particular urgency that meant someone's world was about to end. It was Edwin Kowalski, whispering like he was conducting espionage from his kitchen. "Dale, you need to know. Brenda, she is packing moving truck. Big one. Middle of night. Very suspicious behavior." I threw on clothes and drove past Brenda's house just as the sun was painting the mountains gold. Sure enough, a commercial moving truck sat in her driveway while she supervised the loading of expensive furniture, her Tesla already packed with personal items. The woman who'd spent 6 months trying to drive me out of the valley was apparently planning her own strategic retreat, but not before one final desperate gambit that was either brilliant or completely insane. Probably both. Sarah Olivia called an hour later with news that made my coffee taste like battery acid. "Mr. Brennan, Brenda just filed for an emergency restraining order claiming you've been stalking her family and making terrorist threats against HOA property. She's asking for federal protection under anti-domestic terrorism statutes." The legal papers were a masterpiece of creative fiction. According to Brenda's sworn affidavit, I was a disgruntled military veteran with documented anger management issues who had been conducting surveillance of HOA families and threatening to sabotage community infrastructure. She'd even included photographs of me taking water flow measurements as evidence of suspicious reconnaissance activity. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the same day as peak spring snowmelt, a timing that was either coincidental or proof that Brenda understood exactly how screwed she was about to be. That afternoon brought the kind of coordination you'd expect from a military operation, if military operations involved environmental lawyers, forensic accountants, and very angry fish biologists. Kate Morrison arrived with a legal brief thick enough to stop bullets, while Dr. Rodriguez brought real-time flood modeling data that painted a terrifying picture of what was coming. "Dale," Kate said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "She's trying to tie up the legal system until after flood season. If she can get a restraining order keeping you away from the creek during the flood, there won't be any witnesses to document what happens to those homes." The Weather Service had upgraded to a flash flood warning. Snowpack in the high country was melting faster than anyone had predicted, and multiple storm systems were converging on Colorado during the worst possible timing. Cottonwood Creek was already running at 200% of normal flow, with peak conditions still days away. But Brenda had made one critical error in her final desperation play. The restraining order required her to appear in federal court and testify under oath about her claims, which meant she'd have to explain her surveillance accusations while prosecutors had recordings of her offering bribes and threatening witnesses. Agent Park from the FBI had been quietly building her case for weeks, following the money trail through Brenda's business network like a bloodhound with a federal badge. The embezzlement charges were solid, nearly $200,000 stolen from homeowner assessments through fraudulent contracts and kickbacks. Add in the witness intimidation, the bribery attempts, and the environmental crimes, and Brenda was looking at serious federal prison time. The night before the hearing, I sat in my workshop cleaning grandfather's service revolver. Not because I expected trouble, but because some rituals help you think clearly. The creek was roaring now, spring snowmelt turning the concrete channel into a high-pressure water cannon aimed at million-dollar foundations. Martha found me there at midnight, studying flood predictions by lamplight. Tomorrow changes everything, doesn't it? One way or another, I said, listening to water fighting against concrete constraints. Either the legal system works or physics teaches the lesson. The media attention had reached the kind of intensity usually reserved for political scandals or environmental disasters. Denver news stations were planning live coverage of both the court hearing and the flood conditions. Environmental law blogs had turned my case into a symbol of citizen activism against corporate-style HOA abuse. The hashtag #ConcreteVsNature was trending nationally. Sarah had discovered that Brenda's family had already purchased a house in Florida, proof of premeditated flight before the legal consequences hit. Bank records showed liquidated investments, closed accounts, and asset transfers designed to hide money from potential judgments. The woman was essentially fleeing the state while accusing me of being a terrorist. Edwin stopped by that evening with intelligence from the final HOA board meeting. Only Brenda and one remaining ally had attended, while panicked homeowners demanded answers about flood insurance, legal liability, and foundation warranty claims. Several families had already filed suit against the HOA for unauthorized modifications that voided their coverage. "Dale," Edwin said, "this woman, she has made herself enemy of everyone. Even people who voted for Concrete Project, they understand now she was lying to them." The irony was perfect. Brenda had spent months trying to turn the community against me, but her own greed and desperation had accomplished exactly the opposite. She'd isolated herself so completely that even her former allies were distancing themselves from the legal wreckage. Tomorrow, federal court would decide whether environmental law could protect citizens from HOA tyranny. But spring floods don't wait for legal decisions. Physics was about to render its own verdict on concrete versus nature, and physics, unlike Brenda, had never lost a case. The federal courthouse in Denver was packed tighter than a sardine can on March 22nd, with overflow crowds watching live streams in the lobby while news crews fought for position outside. Judge Martha Blackwood, no relation, but a woman whose reputation for environmental law enforcement had made corporate lawyers break out in nervous sweats, presided over what local media had dubbed the Creek War Trial. Environmental groups filled half the gallery, veterans organizations claimed another section, and local families who'd been fighting their own HOA battles occupied the rest. Outside, spring snowmelt was pushing Cottonwood Creek to dangerous levels, while inside, Brenda Hartwell was about to learn that karma comes with compound interest. Kate Morrison's opening statement was surgical in its precision. "Your Honor, this case represents the systematic destruction of a century-old ecosystem to satisfy one woman's personal vendetta against a neighbor who wouldn't bow to her authority. The defendant didn't just violate environmental law, she embezzled nearly $200,000 from her own community to fund this destruction." Brenda's lawyer, a nervous-looking associate from Pemberton and Associates, tried to paint me as a radical environmentalist blocking legitimate development. His voice cracked when he claimed the concrete channeling was necessary flood control infrastructure approved by qualified contractors. Then Kate played the recordings. The courthouse went dead silent as Brenda's voice filled the room, offering bribes and threatening Martha's career. You could hear gasps from the gallery when the secret HOA meeting recording revealed her true motivations, driving out incompatible residents to boost property values for her real estate business. "Your Honor," Kate said, "the defendant's own words prove this was never about flood control. This was about using HOA authority to conduct ethnic and economic cleansing of longtime residents." My testimony was straightforward. 30 years of flood control experience explained in terms a jury could understand. I showed the judge grandfather's 1973 engineering report, predicting exactly what would happen when concrete replaced natural flood absorption. Computer animations demonstrated how the channel directed 400% more water toward the HOA homes during peak flow conditions. But the real drama came when Dr. Rodriguez presented real-time flood monitoring data. Creek flow was approaching record levels while we sat in court, and the concrete channel was performing exactly as grandfather had predicted, like a high-pressure fire hose aimed at million-dollar basements. Your Honor, Dr. Rodriguez testified, this concrete installation has created an imminent threat to public safety. During peak flood conditions, which we're experiencing right now, water velocity in that channel will reach levels capable of undermining foundation stability. The judge called a 30-minute recess when the National Weather Service issued a flash flood emergency for our area. Court officers evacuated the lower level of the courthouse while emergency crews responded to flooding reports throughout the valley. When we reconvened, Brenda looked like she'd seen her own ghost. Her lawyer was frantically checking his phone, probably getting updates from the disaster zone she'd created. That's when Kate delivered the mic drop moment of the century. Your Honor, while we've been in session this morning, the defendant's concrete channel has begun flooding the very homes it was supposed to protect. Emergency crews are pumping water from basements in Willowbrook Estates while Mr. Brennan's property, upstream and naturally elevated, remains completely dry. Live television coverage from helicopter news crews confirmed the beautiful irony. Water was backing up behind Brenda's concrete bottleneck, creating exactly the foundation flooding that grandfather's engineering had prevented for 70 years. Million-dollar homes sat in lakes of muddy water while my shabby workshop stayed bone dry on higher ground. Brenda's public meltdown was captured by every camera in the courthouse. She accused me of orchestrating the flood emergency, claimed environmental groups had somehow weaponized the weather, and demanded federal protection from what she called my eco-terrorist conspiracy. Judge Blackwood's patience evaporated like morning dew. Ms. Hartwell, you will control yourself or be held in contempt. The court has heard enough. FBI agents served additional warrants during the lunch break, seizing financial records related to the racketeering investigation. EPA enforcement officers were simultaneously securing the concrete work sites as crime scenes. Colorado Attorney General investigators arrived with evidence of systematic HOA fraud affecting multiple developments across the state. The afternoon session was academic. Judge Blackwood ruled comprehensively in my favor on every count: Clean Water Act violations, water rights infringement, fraud, conspiracy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She ordered immediate removal of all concrete, complete creek restoration, and damages totaling $750,000, including attorney fees and punitive awards. More importantly, she established legal precedent protecting water rights from HOA overreach, creating a framework other homeowners could use to fight similar abuse. The press conference outside the courthouse felt like a victory celebration. Environmental lawyers called it a landmark case. Veterans groups presented me with a community service award. Children from the high school environmental club gave Martha hand-drawn thank you cards. But the real victory was simpler than legal precedents or media attention. That evening, as emergency crews pumped floodwater from Brenda's basement while contractors prepared to liberate my grandfather's creek, I stood on the back porch with Martha and listened to water flowing where it belonged. Justice sounds like running water, she said, and for the first time in months, that water was flowing free. 6 months later, you wouldn't recognize Cottonwood Creek. Where ugly concrete once imprisoned flowing water, a natural channel now winds through restored banks lined with native willows and wildflowers that bloom like nature's own celebration. The sound that wakes me every morning isn't the harsh scrape of water fighting concrete. It's the gentle babble of a creek that remembers how to be itself again. The restoration became a community effort that would have made grandfather proud. Local contractors donated equipment and labor. High school students planted native vegetation as a biology project. And even some guilt-ridden former HOA members showed up with shovels and checkbooks. The smell of fresh earth mixed with mountain water replaced the industrial stench of concrete dust and diesel exhaust. Martha and I spend our evenings walking the restored banks, watching native trout that have returned to spawn in gravel beds that had been buried for months. The texture of smooth river stones under our boots, the sight of children fishing where concrete trenches once scarred the landscape. It's better than grandfather ever imagined because it's been reborn through community effort rather than one man's vision. The broader impact rippled outward like stones thrown in still water. Colorado's legislature passed what environmental groups nicknamed Dale's Law, legislation strengthening property rights against HOA overreach and requiring environmental impact studies before any modifications to natural waterways. Law schools from Stanford to Harvard now teach the Brennan Creek case as a model for citizen environmental enforcement. The financial justice was thorough and satisfying. That $750,000 judgment funded the complete restoration, paid all legal fees, and left enough surplus to establish the William Brennan Environmental Engineering Scholarship at Colorado State University. The first recipient was Sarah Olivia, who'd graduated law school and joined the EPA's Enforcement Division, carrying forward the fight against environmental criminals. Brenda's fate was almost anticlimactic after the dramatic courthouse showdown. She pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges and received 18 months in minimum security prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and complete restitution to the HOA victims. Her real estate license was permanently revoked, her assets seized to pay damages, and her family relocated to Florida where they live quietly and avoid discussing their Colorado adventure. The concrete company owner received 2 years and $2 million in environmental fines. 3 former HOA board members got probation and community service, spending their weekends restoring damaged waterways throughout the state. Edwin Kowalski was elected HOA president unanimously and implemented new bylaws requiring environmental review for any future projects. But the real transformation was deeper than legal victories or financial settlements. Willowbrook had evolved from a gated community of suspicious strangers into an actual neighborhood where people knew each other's names and worked together on common problems. The annual Creek Festival draws thousands of visitors who come to see what grassroots environmental activism can accomplish when ordinary people decide they've had enough. My workshop has returned to its original purpose, restoring vintage motorcycles and teaching neighborhood kids about engines, water flow, and the importance of standing up to bullies. The walls are covered with thank you letters from homeowners fighting similar battles across the country, requests for advice, and invitations to speak at environmental conferences. Martha returned to teaching with new curriculum incorporating watershed protection and citizen activism. Her students' science fair projects on creek restoration won regional competitions and caught the attention of university researchers studying community-based environmental solutions. The Cottonwood Creek Redemption Project has become a model replicated in dozens of communities where developers and HOAs have damaged natural waterways. Federal agencies use our case study and training programs, showing how citizen enforcement can accomplish what understaffed government agencies sometimes can't. Last week, I got a phone call from a homeowner in Arizona facing nearly identical creek destruction by her HOA. As I listened to her story, concrete channeling, embezzled funds, intimidation campaigns, I realized this fight was bigger than one creek in Colorado. Martha and I are considering whether to help other communities facing similar battles, turning our workshop into a resource center for environmental self-defense. But for now, it's enough to sit on the back porch at sunset, listening to Grandfather's Creek sing its ancient song while Martha reads letters from supporters nationwide. Home isn't just where your house sits. It's where your values are protected and your community thrives. So here's my challenge to you. If you've got an HOA nightmare story brewing in your neighborhood, drop it in the comments below. You might be surprised how many legal options you actually have when petty tyrants try to destroy something beautiful. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because next week we're covering the case of the HOA that tried to ban vegetable gardens and the 73-year-old grandmother who fought back with the Constitution and won. Sometimes the best revenge against bullies is patience, preparation, and letting nature reclaim what was always hers.
We appreciate you spending your time with us on HOA Stories, where HOA Karens finally get checked. If you enjoyed today's drama, hit like, comment on your favorite part below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll be the first to catch our next HOA Showdown.